Good morning, everyone. This is Elea Feit from the Wharton Customer Analytics Initiative, and I'm very pleased today that we can bring you what is the second of our practitioner-oriented webinars. So today we'll be talking about marketing experiments from the basics to the cutting edge. For those of you who are new to the Wharton Customer Analytics Initiative, we're a research center based at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And as many of you know, our kind of key research activity is bringing companies and academics together to do research related to the sort of overwhelming amount of customer data that is now available to companies. I'm very pleased today that we're going to have Eric Schwartz presenting. He's a doctoral candidate in marketing here at the Wharton School. And he's done some very exciting work that I think is really in the spirit of the Wharton Customer Analytics Initiative, real cutting-edge research that he's actually been doing collaboratively with a company. And he'll tell you more about that later. But we thought it might be a little bit much for everyone to jump right into the work that Eric's doing. So I'm going to back up for the first 20 minutes or so and just give you an introduction to marketing experiments. So I'll be covering the basics, and then Eric will handle the cutting-edge research. Just one housekeeping thing before we get started. I know that you should be able to type questions into the webinar, and we'll be watching those questions as the webinar goes on. So whenever you have a question, feel free to type it in. I apologize if we don't get into all of them, get to answering all of the questions. We have actually a pretty large audience today. There's over 200 people on already, so it might be a little difficult for us to get to every single question out loud. So anyway, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So let's get started. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the basics of marketing testing and basically A/B testing and multivariate testing. But before I get into that, let me kind of put testing in marketing in a little bit of context. So I have a sort of 3-bullet history of experiments in business practice. For those of you who don't know, a lot of the sort of mechanics of experimentation, including multivariate testing, were developed in the sort of 30s and 40s and led to the agricultural revolution in the 60s. So they were really experiments designed to figure out how, with a given plot of land, to produce as much food as possible. And it turned out this had tremendous business relevance. It actually led to a massive increase in food production, a tenfold increase in food production. And part of why there are as many people on the planet today as there are is sort of due to the experiments that people did to figure out how to grow crops efficiently. And so that was kind of the real first use of experiments in business practice. More recently, some of you may have been exposed to testing in manufacturing industries. So in the 1980s, experimentation methods gained popularity in manufacturing, and they actually led to sort of tenfold type gains in quality of products. So the fact that you get your laptop and it usually works right off the bat is in large part due to the fact that people are using experiments in manufacturing to figure out what's the best way to screw things together. And more recently, in, say, the past decade or so, testing has actually become a popular tool in marketing. And kind of the vision of this is that we could gain the same kind of tenfold increases in marketing return on investment. What we get when we run an ad could increase by a lot if we systematically test and figure out what are the kinds of ads that work the best. Some of you may be wondering kind of why testing in marketing now. The answer actually has to do with digital marketing. A lot of the testing that's happening in marketing is happening in the digital space. And there's really 2 special things about digital marketing that are driving experimentation in digital marketing. The first is that in digital marketing, we get to see much more of the shopping and the purchase process than in other mediums. In television, say, you put that advertisement out there, you can kind of measure what the sales were the week afterwards, but you don't get very precise measurement of, like, did people show up in the store and did they browse certain products, et cetera, when they were exposed to a particular ad. In the digital space, we get to see kind of all those intermediary steps that happen between an advertisement and the purchase. So that gives us measurement. The other interesting thing about the digital space is that we can send different marketing messages to individual customers. So it's possible to send one email to Eric and a different email to me, and see what happens to the two of us separately, and that basically gives us control. And when you put measurement and control together, you enable experimentation. So, 20 years ago, we didn't have very good measurement. We didn't have a really good way of controlling who saw which advertisement, and so it was really difficult to do experiments in marketing. People did try to do them. There was quite a bit of work actually in direct marketing. But then as you got into the other mediums like radio and television and magazines, it was just so difficult to execute a clean experiment that people didn't do it very much. And today, you really see that digital marketing has the measurement and control that are the key ingredients for experimentation. And that's part of why we're seeing an explosion of experimentation in marketing right now. So what is it? What it actually is an experiment? Let me just sort of jump in and explain what an ABCDE test is. It's pretty simple. So once you have this measurement and control, you randomly divide the customers into 2 or more groups. In the case of the graphic I have here, we've got 3 groups, the original, combination 1, and combination 2. And we randomly divide the customers into these groups. Then we expose each group to a different advertisement. Pretty simple stuff. If you have the capability of sending each group different advertisements, you do that. Then you measure the outcome for each group, and you compare them. And so that's pretty much all there is to an A/B test. That's it in a nutshell. I do want to point out that it's really important that you compare the outcomes using confidence intervals or some kind of statistical measure of uncertainty. One of the examples I use in the class that I teach on experiments is, if I toss a coin and I get 2 heads out of 3, and you toss a different coin and you get 1 head out of 3, that doesn't mean that either of us potentially has an unfair coin. It's just too small a sample size to make any clear judgments about whether either of those coins is an unfair coin. So you want to use some kind of measure of uncertainty. The classic one for ABCD testing is confidence intervals. And you can see here in this graphic, this is the experiment running at day 1. We have really wide confidence intervals. As we get to day 5, we have more and more information, more and more data is collected. We get a better sense of what's going on. And by the time we get to day 10, we've got these really narrow confidence intervals, and it's very clear that combination 2 is outperforming the original in combination 1. So the whole idea behind testing is to gather this systematic information about which ads are working well. And then, of course, in the future, we're going to, mostly run combination 2 because it seems to be the ad that's working well. Next, I'm going to just briefly review a bunch of different opportunities there are for A/B testing in digital marketing. Now that you kind of get the basic idea of what an A/B test is, just to give you a sense of kind of how many opportunities there really are for testing in the digital marketing space. So let's just start with email. Most of us have received an email ad. It's a pretty straightforward thing. There are so many testable features to an email. You could test what the subject line says, whether or not it has discounts and promotions, almost endless features of the creative. We could change this pink color to a blue color. We could change the font to a sans serif font. We could change the picture of the woman to a picture of someone else. All of those things are testable features in an email. The time and day that you send the email, and the subject line again. And there's lots of measurable outcomes. One of the really nice things about email is that there's lots of different things that you can measure as responses to the email. So right away, you can get the open and the click-through. You can look at what products customers view after they see the email. You can look at downstream sales, or in the case of a service, subscriptions. You can look at how much time people spend on the site. You can even look at whether people are unsubscribing in response to the email, kind of a negative outcome of the email that can happen. So we've got all of these great testable features, lots of measurable outcomes. A lot of times you'll see an effect on an intermediate outcome, like open and click-through, that there'll be sort of too much noise in the data to see it happening at the sales level. So that's one of the reasons why having these kind of intermediate variables can actually improve your experimentation program a lot, because you can kind of use these intermediate variables as sort of proxies for what's going on and get a better picture of how the advertising is affecting your customers. Really, everyone should be doing testing who's sending out emails. If any company is sending emails, it's really simple to do this kind of A/B testing. It's just very easy to control, and I kind of feel like everyone who's sending an email should be testing their emails. Let's move on to websites. So that's another sort of form of marketing that you have, is your website. It could be an online store. It could be an online brochure. Actually, could be a web-based service site. And I think people aren't doing enough testing a lot on sites that are actually providing a service, and how customers are interacting with that service is a big opportunity to improve the quality of that service interaction through testing. The focus tends to be on acquisition channels and kind of the marketing piece of this, but also in the service delivery, there's a lot of opportunity for testing. On your website, there's kind of the same sort of slew of testable features as you might have in email. So there's the headlines and the call to action and kind of all the interesting things about the creative, and the same sort of set of measurable outcomes, the sales. A lot of people use measurements of kind of intermediate steps in shopping, like putting a product in the cart, which is kind of a measure, the time on site, the churn, kind of all those types of things can be measured. And it's also pretty easy to execute a test on a website. It takes a little bit of more coordination, say, with your IT department. But because we usually own and run the target website, it's usually easy to execute a clean test in this kind of environment. In fact, there's free tools out there. So it's pretty easy to use those free tools to, basically what you do is, as this graphic shows, you set up two completely different versions of your website, and as new users come to your website, you split them into two groups, in this case the A group and the B group, the blue and the green group, and you show them different versions of the website, and then you measure different outcomes of what people are buying or looking at on the website to see if you're driving the outcomes that you're interested in. So website testing is really a great area that people should be doing more of, and people are doing more and more of. Another opportunity for testing that actually Eric will talk a little bit about later is display and video advertising. So these can be pre-roll ads on YouTube or just typical display ads like you see here on Yahoo. There's also almost a billion things you might be able to test about a display ad, the creative, whether or not it has animation. When you get into display, now you also have to think about where is the ad placed relative to the publisher content that it's placed with. So you have to think about which websites is it being placed on and where is it being placed on the page. That's something that you could do some testing on. Also the target audience. So there is some control over which types of people are seeing your advertisement through some display networks, and you could do some testing specifically on which target audiences are responding well. Lots of good measurable outcomes. Click-throughs, you don't usually see a lot of action on click-throughs with display ads because people tend not to click on them at all, even if the ad is providing a effective message. But then you can look at whether or not the user ever visited the target website, so without the click-through, how long they spent on a target website, whether they ultimately purchased, and all the kinds of intermediate steps in the purchase process that you might measure for a website as well. The thing about display and video advertising, and I just pulled this graphic, which is the IAB's sort of graphic on what the display advertising technology universe looks like. It's extremely complicated, and a lot of people are making lots of decisions. Publishers are making decisions about which ads to show. And so it can be hard to execute a clean test because when you're measuring marketing ROI, a clean test really means splitting people up into two groups randomly and then exposing them differentially to the two display ads. And if the display network kind of gets in there and starts sort of screwing up that randomization, not because they're trying to ruin your test, but because they're trying to optimize from their perspective the amount of money they get for that advertising inventory. It just can be hard to execute a clean test. So not that I discourage people from doing it. Actually, Eric has done some really nice testing work in display advertising. It just requires more discipline around making sure that all the details get executed cleanly.
And this is Eric here. Just to interrupt, we have a nice question about some of the difficulties of testing more generally, not on display and video advertising, but one participant is asking, A/B testing is useful, but sometimes the findings in one study are overblown for future uses. When should the trend be taken at full worth, and when with a grain of salt?
That's a great question. And that really gets to kind of putting together a complete testing program. So just because you test something once doesn't mean, and you got good statistically relevant results that say that combination 2 is better, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better in the future. It could be that the users are going to change. It could be a different context. Just because a certain advertisement is working for Zappos doesn't mean that that same advertisement is going to work for, Amazon.com. All of those are kind of important issues. One of the things and I don't have a straight answer for that, but one of the things that we talk about in the class that I teach is about assessing the external validity of an experiment. So that just means how extensible, how much can I take the results of this experiment and apply it in another context. And there's no technical answer to that question. It's more just thinking through logically, is the new context essentially in the important regards the same as the context in which I did the test. But for those of you who are taking the class, that's kind of a favorite exam question of mine is, take the results of this test and describe to me, can we extend those results into these other settings? And the way we describe it is, what are the threats to the validity of this test in that other setting? All right, I'm going to keep going, Eric. So I have a couple more forms of advertising I wanted to tell you about. Sorry, I advanced my slide too far there. So moving kind of on from display advertising, we have to talk a little bit about search advertising. In search advertising, advertisers bid on how much they would like to pay for a click on their link, and the search engine decides which ads to show. There's lots of cool things you can test in search advertising, the ad text, the landing page, the amount you want to bid. And actually, as part of my class, the class designs a test and executes it live on Google. And so we have actually designed tests around all these kinds of features. There's lots of good measurable outcomes. I won't go through them all right now, but it's definitely possible to execute a test within search advertising. It can be very tricky because ideally we want to test the customer's response to different search advertisements. So we really want to randomize treatments between users. But when you do this, you got to keep in mind that Google is in the picture, and that can kind of make your view of the customer go a little bit fuzzy. So Google is trying to maximize their revenues, and they don't always execute kind of clean randomization between the treatments unless you're really careful about how you set it up. So I really think search advertising is a great area for testing, but kind of one of the hardest places to do testing. Mostly because that search engine is deciding who sees which ads, and it can just be very, very difficult to randomize exposures across users. The last form of advertising I wanted to talk a little bit about is social media marketing. So you can get brand exposures through Facebook fan pages and apps. You can get exposures to sponsored stories and Facebook display ads. And it's kind of similar to display advertising, search advertising, in that Facebook controls who sees the ads, and the tools are rapidly evolving, but it still can be hard, tricky to actually make sure that you execute a perfectly clean test on Facebook. So I think this is a great area for people to be looking in the future, but like I said, it's just sort of a little bit tricky to execute that right now. So I hope you see we've kind of zipped through all the different forms of digital marketing there are and what the opportunities for testing are. You notice I ordered them kind of from the easiest to the hardest. So if you want to take that home as sort of a to-do guide, we should, if we're going to start a testing program, let's start in email because that's going to be the easiest. Before I hand things off to Eric, I kind of have to finish my job of telling you about the other type of testing that's sort of floating around out there. So I'm just going to switch gears for just a minute and talk a little bit about multivariate testing. So we talked about A/B testing, where you just divide people up randomly into different groups and expose them to different forms, different versions of the advertisement. And that's definitely the place to start. That's where you want to start your testing program with A/B testing and just get a feel for how A/B testing works. But as soon as you get into that, you start to realize there's all these different features that I could test. So in this graphic here, we have like some example web pages with different headlines, a different offer, a different picture of a hero, and there's all these different things, and I'd like to test all of them. And a multivariate test is a way to kind of build a single test that allows you to put all those features together in the same test. So you should use a multivariate test when you have all these different features and you want to know the relative effects of the different features. So you want to know, should I be spending money in the picture? Should I be hiring better writers to write the headline? Kind of all those things. It's also useful when you think there might be interactions between the features. So this gets actually to the question that was asked earlier about the extensibility of an A/B test. Often with an A/B test, you might find out that headline 1 is better than headline 4. But that might be holding the hero picture fixed. And it could be there's a special magic between one of the hero pictures and one of the headlines. And that by putting those together, you get a really much bigger effect than the sum of the parts of those two. And so multivariate testing, when done right, can allow you to measure the interactions between things and find out kind of where those sort of better than the sums of their parts type opportunities are in your advertising. So if you suspect that there's any of those, you really should move into a multivariate testing program where you're manipulating multiple features of your advertisement at once. It turns out that by making some reasonable assumptions about the interactions, you can actually work out what the effect of each item is with fewer customers and without testing all the combinations. So that's where you get a design expert who can kind of put the multivariate test design together for you. That person can tell you what assumptions they're making and make some reasonable business assumptions about the interactions, and then give you sort of if we test all these combinations, then on the back end with the math, we can back out what the separate effects of each thing are. All right, so that kind of wraps up the basics. I hope I've given you, in 23 minutes, given you kind of a quick overview of marketing experiments and kind of the many opportunities for marketing experiments. But next I'd like to switch gears and really get to what I think is the meat of today's webinar, which is Eric Schwartz. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about some research that he's been doing lately that really pushes experiments to the cutting edge. And I think this is a great example of what WCAI is trying to do, which is really bring kind of the latest innovative ideas from the academic community forward so that people can see kind of what's next in the marketing experiment space. Eric, you ready to get started?
Absolutely. Ellie, thank you so much for the introduction and for the great first half of this webinar, and hello to everyone out there. I'm very excited to be talking to all of you about this work because, as Ellie said, it's really bringing some ideas that we're now familiar with, whether some of these ideas about experimentation were familiar to you before or it's fairly new to you, bringing it into some of the real-world issues that you're going to be seeing once you get to applying it. So what I'd really like to focus on is, suppose you're sitting at the edge of, you've been running A/B tests or ABN tests or even multivariate testing. A lot of what you're probably thinking, and often a lot of folks are doing, is something that we'll call test and learn, right? And what does that translate to? It translates to you running a test, and then you crown the winner. You're looking for the best email, the best online advertisement, and you crown that winner and you run with it. Well, there are a couple of issues with that. And what I want to really reframe this as is something of continuous improvement. And as a marketer, more and more, what we're seeing is as testing becomes part of the regular business activities, as Elea made the case, you can really be testing for almost everything in a digital space. We want to be making a profit while learning. So instead of calling it test and learn, I think we ought to be calling it earn while learning, or earn and learn. And let me give you an example of that. And as I go through some of these extensions and natural complications, I'm going to be using the language of online display advertising, banner ads in particular, for the purposes of, say, acquiring customers. I'm just going to be using that language. I think it's going to make things more concrete, but hopefully you'll be able to see how much more general that is. So suppose you're an advertiser and you're sitting with 10 million impressions at your disposal over the next 2 weeks. You have a lot of questions. You want to know how should you allocate those impressions across the many ads that you have. And you don't just have many ads in the A, B, N test, but you might have attributes describing those ads, like a multivariate test. But to go a bit further, since you're an advertiser, you've also bought media on a lot of different websites. And so the way visitors on one website may respond to your ads and those attributes may differ when you're looking at the way visitors on another website respond. And to push things a little further, as I just framed that problem, you're looking at millions of impressions, and you need to decide essentially to give to the advertising delivery server instructions. And those instructions come in the form of proportions, ad allocations. What percent of the ads over the next couple of days or week should be dedicated to each ad. And finally, if we're talking about acquisitions per impression, real conversions, as Elea was alluding to before, sometimes we're talking about really rare events. And so let me before I get into some of the details of how we're going to resolve that, let me just take a step back and say what I think you should be able to take away from the next 25 or 30 minutes of this talk. And first, I would hope that a lot of you now are going to be able to view a lot of your everyday marketing problems as continual adaptive experiments. What I'm going to talk about is this tension between wanting to continue experimenting. Some of you may already have it in your mind, well, how do I know when to stop the test and start taking advantage of that learning? When do I kind of make the switch from testing to earning, or learning to earning? That's this notion of an explore versus exploit dilemma. And it's well known in a lot of literatures, from statistics to operations to economics and computer science, something known as the multi-arm bandit framework. And we'll get into this in detail in a couple of minutes, but it's a stylized version of the following. Suppose you're a gambler and you walk into a casino and you look at several slot machines. Each slot machine is known as the one-arm bandit, and you really just want to make as much money as possible. And so we can think of each of our ads or emails as just different slot machines that we're trying to learn which slot machine might be best. And so, once again, this transition from test and learn to doing it profitably and earn and learn. So right now, I want to jump into an example. Now, these are just a couple of banner advertisements that you might see. They happen to be from a financial service company, ING Direct, which does a lot of advertising. And you might be looking at these three ads and asking the question, which ad brings in the most customers, which has the highest conversion rate? And perhaps before hearing this webinar, or just after the first half, you might run an ABC test. At the end of the test, you'll pick the winner and go with it. And that's this always be testing mentality. But one of the issues is, even once we look at some of the, say, confidence intervals around that performance, we're not really sure what to do about it. Are we sure that's really the winner? Should we give up on the ads that came in second place or were close to the winner? And also, you can see with these three ads, they're clearly attributes. Two of them are this orange concept. One of them is this green tree concept. 2 of them are square-ish, and 1 of them is tall. As Ellie was mentioning, there's a pretty complicated landscape in just ad formats. So you can see this is what we mean by attributes of ads, and they could be even more complicated. And for example, this is really what the problem looks like. What you're looking at now is 12 different advertisements. You can see that there are 3 different types, formats, sizes of the ads, and then there are 4 different ad concepts, so creative executions that are running live at the same time. Further, there are many websites. So you may be asking, the advertiser has, say, 10 million impressions and needs to decide within the impressions that will be dedicated to, say, Yelp or to the Yahoo network of sites, how should we be allocating our impressions that we've already bought across these many ads? And to really try to do this, things start getting a little more complicated than the regular multivariate test. And one of the reasons is if you were to just run that multivariate test, you might eventually get to learn what you want to learn, but you could get there a lot quicker. Why bother serving so many ads that turn out they're not the winner, and you could learn that sooner? So let's not leave money on the table, but let's really focus in on trying to start taking advantage of those learnings sooner. And that's what really the core message of this talk is going to be about. So what I would like to do before diving into some of the methods is give you a sense of what analysts are often looking at when they look at the results of tests. Ellie showed something similar looking. Here's something that you might see. This is a snapshot from just a company that happens to provide a service for testing. You can see there's this big focus on the winner and the losers. Which combinations, these might be ads or websites or emails, which combinations look like they're the winning combination, which ones are still inconclusive compared to some control, and which ones perhaps are the loser. And this is well and good. This is using confidence intervals that many of you must be familiar with, but it doesn't directly inform action. And so what we're going to try to do is take this idea of just looking at past data and try to come up with and use this rich literature of what's known as the multi-arm bandit problem to directly inform what should we do about it. So we have results from an experiment, but how should we be continually adapting that test to make as much money as possible, to acquire as many customers as possible? So let me introduce everyone to the multi-arm bandit. Here are 2 slot machines. We've got the red one on the left, the gray one on the right. And what I want to be communicating here is that the vertical axis is just payoff, average payout. And you really don't know. But what you've seen so far, based on putting a little money in each slot machine, and you can call these ads or emails, is for whatever reason, the red one looks to be a bit better on average. And for whatever reason, maybe we've played the gray one less than the red one. Maybe we've played it just as much, but its response has been, its payout has been variable, more variable. The gray one has a lower average, but we're less certain about that average. Now, you may be thinking, well, if I just want to make money on average, let me just always pick the red slot machine. Unfortunately, you'd be wrong. Picking the winner in this case wouldn't really be the right thing to do, because the goal is to be making profit over the long term. And you want to balance this desire between exploiting what you know and exploring and continuing to learn so you can make more profit down the road. So why would you ever pick the gray slot machine? Because of that upside. Because of what you're seeing here is the potential, the possible range of its true payout. So you may play the gray slot machine, put more money into that ad, and find out actually that true conversion rate is higher than the average conversion rate for the red slot machine. And now you're in a better place. Now you know that you can play that one, and you will be making more money than if you were to have stuck with the red slot machine. This is this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. And for those interested in this, you can search around in the multi-armed bandit. This problem in its simplest form is more than a half-century old. There's nothing new here. And in fact, some folks have already brought it into the online advertising world. But it's really important to get this intuition down, because the simple approaches that have been developed over decades turn out to not apply to the more complicated setting that we've posed with many ads, many attributes, many contexts, etc. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this time. Let me just take a broader look at the multi-armed bandit problem and this class of earn and learn problems. I wouldn't want you, just like Elliot said, to come away and say, well, this is just about an example of online advertising. It's far from it. You can look at any of these companies and different business settings. Take LL Bean, a standard multi-channel retailer. You can think of their email campaigns to different types of customers. All of these you can imagine, as was portrayed earlier in the webinar, they all revolve around that same question of what should we be sending and how much of it to which types of customers. And that's the multi-armed bandit problem at its core, with all of these rich extensions. And as we get into some of these rich extensions, let me dive right into an actual field experiment that I did run with a big advertiser. Going to remain anonymous for now, but let me just show you the scale of this particular online advertisement experiment. We're talking about over 500 million impressions delivered over the course of a few months. And these advertisements were scattered across over 50-plus media placements. And that's ranging from individual websites to, for the folks that are more familiar with the online display media landscape, to demand-side platforms, to exchanges, to ad networks, et cetera. You can see just a sample of those websites. And again, because we're looking at conversions per impression, if you serve 1 million impressions, you may be looking to see about 1 to 10 actual new customers. And that's just industry standards. So now you must be asking, well, how did we really merge this nice idea of managing this trade-off between exploration and exploitation with a very real, complex problem at scale, very real scale that was implemented? Well, here's to give you a little intuition about how, and then be able to show you some of those results from the field experiment and why adaptive experimentation is doing better than, say, a static, balanced experiment. There's a range of strategies. And what I mean by a balanced static experiment is pretty much what we had in mind when we were talking about A/B testing or multivariate testing. It's, as was described earlier, take the different combinations and just give equal allocation. So in the context of online advertising, there would be the rotation weights, which is known in the online display language, the proportions with which each ad is served through the delivery system is equal within each site. Now, at the other extreme, there's something called the greedy algorithm, a heuristic, just a shortcut that says, we've seen enough information, let's just crown the winner, and let's throw all of our eggs in one basket. And so that we're going to call winner take all, but there seems to be some need to be in the middle of those two, because a winner take all strategy seems a bit risky, especially since we're dealing with small sample sizes or a wide range of sources of variation. You may not want to take the risk of putting all your eggs in one basket. You don't want to be as risk averse as just doing nothing as a static experiment, but we want something more adaptive but also smoother allocations, right? That's precisely what we're going to be able to get in some of these advanced ways to manage this multi-arm bandit problem. So let me describe some of these benchmarks. Then I'm going to get into something that's called probability matching that will answer exactly that point number 3. So one way, as I mentioned, to manage this multi-arm bandit is quite simple. Let's just look at, here's a case of 4 advertisements, A, B, C, and D. They could have been from these actually are from the example from the field experiment that I was able to run. And you might see that some have higher observed conversion rates than others. So for instance, ad D has the highest observed conversion rate. Ad C is not far behind, or ad A is not far behind, but you also see something that looks like could be a loser in ad B. And so a winner-take-all strategy would be pretty simple and say, well, ad D is the winner. Let's put all of our advertising dollars, all of our impressions for this particular context into that. Now, there are a range of methods that are coming from a nice variety of fields. I'm not going to go into the advanced methods from operations research, as I have listed here, something known as a Gittins index that scores, evaluates the attractiveness of each ad based on its past performance and its potential to that of learning that we could get. From computer science, we see similar methods known as upper confidence bounds. I'm not going to get into that in any detail here. What I do want to focus on is the next strategy, which resolves a couple of problems here. One, that smooth allocation. Why should we give up entirely on advertisement C when we notice that it's performing pretty well? Or advertisement A, that we also see it's performing pretty well, and maybe we have more uncertainty about it. And should we really believe that advertisement B is not worth it at all to explore? And so perhaps we want something that looks a bit more like this. If you look on the right panel, you're going to see an allocation of ad impressions that's smoother, right? It's still favoring the best performers and taking some impressions away from the worst performers, but it's not giving up entirely. So you might ask, well, that's a nice idea, but where are these probabilities coming from? And that's where I really want to spend some time talking about right now. Behind this is a statistical model, a probability model of conversions in this particular case, based on impressions. And what's really important is to reconsider the motivating problem of an advertiser facing a big batch of impressions. The advertiser wants to deliver these impressions across its ads, but also wants to make that decision across lots of websites. So what I'm showing you here is just a snapshot of 4 advertisements on one particular placement where these ads might be served. Now, it turns out that, for example, in this particular placement, advertisement B saw no actual new customers acquired, didn't generate any new customers. Should we believe that the true conversion rate for this advertisement on this placement is a true zero, a true goose egg? Maybe not. And so it's useful to be sharing information across lots of the websites, to not look at this website in isolation, but to be recognize that there's some hierarchical structure, that we have lots of websites and the same experiment is going on in parallel across each website. Just as when we're talking about attributes of ads in a multivariate testing context, we don't want to treat each of the ads in isolation. We want to understand the underlying structure of how do those differ. That's going to not only help us get to the answer faster, but it's going to give us a richer picture of what that answer really is. And so what you're looking at on the left is this box plot that's really showing what the model predicts to be not only the average performance, but also the uncertainty in performance. So it's a bit of a different picture than we saw just before, because now we can really see that while there are differences in the averages, there's quite a range of overlap. That purple ad is not looking that different than the red ad all of a sudden. And so the question is, if these, you might be looking at this as similar to those confidence intervals that we've seen before, but what should we do in the face of this? Well, this approach known as randomized probability matching is a known and actually quite a good performing way to manage the multi-arm bandit. And what's actually nice about it is it can extend to these complicated settings with attributes and multiple contexts where we see the effects of these attributes differ across contexts. But it's a very simple idea. As I have written, it's to allocate the resources to each of these ads in proportion to the probability that each one is the best. So if for some reason we believe that ad D we can estimate from our model that ad D in fact has a probability of being truly the best ad for this particular media placement is 53%, well then lo and behold we will serve it 53% of the time.
Eric.
Yes.
We've had quite a few questions come in about sort of the practicalities of this,
yeah.
and since you did, work with the company to run this experiment, maybe you hadn't planned to talk about this, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the conversion rate. So you were measuring, your key outcome variable here was whether someone actually signed up for a service. Is that right?
That's right. So often what we see in a lot of key performance indicators for online display campaigns is click-through rate.
Yeah, so someone had asked about click-through rate specifically.
Sure. Well, in this case, the advertiser had previously been doing a lot of work based off of click-through rate, recognizing that what they really wanted to look at was conversion rate, because conversions turned into customers, turned into profit, and that's really what they wanted to be looking at to justify the media buy.
And so then the conversions are done through some cookie tracking?
That's right. And so in this particular context, and a lot of online advertising contexts, what advertisers typically use is a particular scheme of ad attribution that's handed down to them possibly by the Google DoubleClick for advertiser server, and that's tracked through cookies. So you'll be essentially handed the number of conversions, number of new customers that were acquired for each advertisement on each website based on the number of impressions that you delivered and were confirmed to be delivered on that placement.
Okay. So it's cookie tracked with the some display advertising network cookie tracking system. Do you have one of the questions about cookies was, there might be better and worse quality cookie tracking systems. I know this is a bit off the sort of track of your research, but is that something you have an opinion on?
Yeah, well, what I do want to comment on, and I think this is more broadly a very valid question because it's raised to sometimes take down the results of testing. And one important question that everyone doing testing might want to ask themselves is there any reason to believe that the particular way of cookie tracking or ad attribution or way of measuring performance here, do we believe that it's going to bias our results in one way or another overall, or is it going to bias our results for particular ads or particular treatments? And if the question is it's just going to inflate the overall levels, then it's not that bad. But if the answer, because in that case, if everything's pretty much treated equally and you just care about eventually finding your way to the best ad in the best place, then you're still in good shape.
Right, so you should always be evaluating the measurement scheme in terms of whether or not it's a threat to the validity of your conclusion. It may be inaccurate,
Absolutely.
but does it invalidate your conclusion that the purple one is a wee bit better than the red one?
Does it change the eventual decision?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We have another question that I'm going to, and then that'll be kind of the last question I think we can handle right now, but I'm just going to read it to you. I see that you've constructed a confidence interval. What if we don't have enough campaigns to construct such a limit to do the probability matching? Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you handle uncertainty when you have that, 2 heads out of 3 tosses sort of situation.
Sure.
You just don't have enough data.
Sure, and this is precisely the context actually I'm working in. Though 500 million impressions might seem like a really large number, for those of you that did the quick arithmetic, if we're only getting success between 1 and 10 out of a million, all of a sudden those sample sizes don't look so big, especially once we divide that up into several advertisements for many websites. Now the sample sizes are actually quite small. There are a lot of zeros, as we see here. And so that's one of the benefits of adding in a statistical model, which, although it's a bit more sophisticated, can really aid the probability matching. Essentially fills in some of those gaps in data by sharing information across lots of different placements. And in statistics, that's just known as a hierarchical model. And with that, that's exactly how we're getting to the answer of how do we compute these probabilities for probability matching. And so this picture right here, I've taken the exact same box plots, I've turned them sideways and showed them as distributions. And what I want to really emphasize is celebrating uncertainty. And that's what that question of sample size really is getting at, is that we actually have a lot of uncertainty here. But that's fine, because that's what we want to learn. That's why we want to learn. That's why we want to be testing. If, for instance, the rug plot, the 4 dots at the bottom of this plot, if we just saw complete certainty, what would we be seeing? We'd see 4 vertical lines, a green, a red, a blue, and a purple. And I would recommend, as would everyone else, just play the purple one with 100% of all of your resources. If you knew with perfect certainty, you're done testing. But that's not the picture that we have here. We have 4 distributions. Our belief of these conversion rates are really overlapping. And so the idea is, with probability matching, since we can really just draw by a simulation, and everyone that's been working in Excel knows about just simulating from a probability distribution, do just that and simulate, and you get one draw, and you might see that in that particular world, red ad A, happened to be the winner. You take another draw, and you might see that the purple ad D, happened to be the winner. And if you do this 100 times or 1,000 times or 10,000 times, you'll start seeing that it converges to some proportion of times that the purple ad is the winner. And as a result, that proportion perhaps is 53%. And that's exactly the proportion with which that purple ad then is served. That's just a sense of how these probabilities are constructed if you have a statistical model. And again, some of these can be complicated models. Some of them could be just regression models, which some of you must be familiar with. Finally, let me just get to the results of this particular experiment, and then we'll wrap up. Again, the company will remain nameless, but they had exactly the question that we've posed. We were able to run it over 2 months. And what you're seeing here is essentially an experiment in 2 different ways of learning about the effectiveness of advertising across websites. And so the blue line shows a static, balanced, multivariate test across all of 12 of those advertisements. And the red line is showing what kind of increase overall we got by using this randomized probability matching with a hierarchical model. And 8% as cumulative lift is not chump change. So say there were a couple of thousand, 2,000 new customers that were acquired. We're talking about over 150 new customers acquired. And that's quite meaningful to the company.
Eric?
Yes?
We have another question that came in. I'm just
Sure.
going to read it straight out for you. a little confused at how you get the distribution of conversion rates. I usually get just one conversion rate from my campaigns, and then I have the standard binomial confidence intervals, but what you have looks different. Can you talk kind of at a high level about how you figure out kind of what the likely conversion rates are, what the distribution of potential conversion rates is for a particular advertisement?
Sure, and this is coming from a prediction from the statistical model that happens to be in play. So if you were to just, I'm going back to that slide, if you were to just use, say, the standard binomial confidence intervals, I agree. You may not be seeing this kind of variation, especially with large sample sizes.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening is, again, we're really embracing the fact that there's many other sources of variation. For instance, that the sample that we have may not be enough, that there are many websites, that we're trying to estimate these underlying attributes of the ads that may cause one ad to perform better than the other. And so what we're doing is we're really appreciating that there's more uncertainty than simply a coin flip with different weights. And so that's
and you're also borrowing information. So if you don't know much about this particular website, you borrow information from the conversion rates from other websites.
Exactly. So one of the benefits here is and as the problem often is, we just bought a new media placement, and we want to know how should we be allocating these, say, 4 ads on a new placement. Well, if you were just using the data from that placement, you're out of luck, because you haven't had any experience with that particular website. But in this case, we're able to share that information and have a best guess at, given what we know about that new website, we can start partially pooling the information and get an answer and a whole distribution of what should be those allocations.
Gotcha.
And let me just stick on this takeaway slide as we get to the top of the hour. And what I really would hope that you take away from this part of the webinar is to really view, as I emphasized up front, a lot of your marketing problems as interactive, adaptive experiments, where you really are aiming for continuous improvement. Testing is really just a means to getting there. And so in doing so, you want to be testing profitably. And keep in mind this tension between exploration and exploitation, and look for this structure in addition to keeping your eyes out for this multi-arm bandit framework. Now, again, this ranges from the technical folks that are interested in the nitty-gritty details of the models and algorithms, but also the folks that are just thinking about, framing tests and bringing tests to be more popular within the organization. Typically is a very useful framework for testing. And I think, Ellie, with that, I'll allow you to
well, I wanted to ask you one last. We had a question that just came in under the wire that I want to ask you.
Great.
And the question is this randomized probability matching done only after a critical number of incidences are achieved?
No, and the answer is no for a variety of reasons. One is the person asking the question may be wondering, do I have to wait for statistical significance to start acting and using this algorithm? And the answer is no, because if there really is no difference, well, then the probability matching algorithm will be suggesting effectively 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. So that's the flexibility of this particular approach, is that when there is no difference, it will tell you to continue testing in that balanced way.
Interesting. It's really interesting work. I really appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today, Eric. Just to wrap things up, unfortunately we won't be able to get to any more questions. This presentation will be archived, so if you enjoyed it, you feel free to email it to your friends and colleagues, and they can register and watch it as well. Those of you who had sort of technical questions, when Eric eventually has a paper on this, is there a paper yet, Eric?
Yeah, it should be coming up. I'll be posting it on SSRN, on my website, and it'll be posted within a couple of weeks. So.
Great. Well, that's the best place to get the technical details on it. And we'll put it on the WCAI SSRN working paper series as well. So you can subscribe to that working paper series, and for those of you who want sort of the nitty-gritty technical details. Another way to get involved with the Customer Analytics Initiative is to become a corporate partner of the initiative. So our corporate partners collaborate together with academics like Eric, and if you're interested in that, feel free to contact me. If you're just interested in sort of in more information about what we're doing as a center, just go to that website and register for our newsletter. We're actually actively seeking out new ways to bring some of the research to life and to the practitioner community. So, you know, we're going to try this. We'll be trying lots of other things, and we appreciate your feedback on all these things that we try as we sort of figure out what's the best way to really bridge the gap between what academics we're working on and what is valuable in practice. I think you'll find that this is a great example of a research project that's just tremendously valuable to people who are working in practice, both in the just sort of the conceptual level of thinking about approaches to experimentation that are earn and learn, like Eric said, but also in implementing the nitty-gritty details of the algorithms that Eric is working on.
And Ellie, I wanted to, before we close, there's been a couple of questions on how participants can gain access to the slides or be able to watch this webinar again.
So I said at the beginning that the webinar will be archived, so you can just register for it and view it, or if you've already registered and are watching now, you can view it again. So.
Great.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It was a great webinar, and I look forward to hearing from everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.